Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932 and dropped this now famous line during his inaugural speech.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Pretty good advice, because during the Roosevelt administration, people generally believed there was plenty to be afraid of. There was the continued economic crisis of the Great Depression, and there was a guy named Hitler over in Europe who was definitely scary.
Denn in euch liegt die Zukunft der Nation und des Deutschen Reichs.
The only thing people weren't afraid of during the period from 1932 to 1945 was the task of remembering the name of a new president, because it was always Roosevelt. He was our longest-serving president, elected 4 times. Some say he was the closest we ever had to a king, and honestly, FDR had about as much money as some kings. Despite his wealth, Roosevelt's own personal hardships helped him understand the hardships of regular Americans.
He had had polio, and it had crippled his legs. He could not walk without assistance. When he walked, he would have to lock the steel braces on both of his legs so that they would be rigid, and then someone would take him by the arm. But the public was not really aware that he was a cripple, because the news media entered into a conspiracy of silence.
It was said, in fact, in the 30s that it took a man on crutches to teach a crippled nation how to walk again.
For America to walk again, 10 million Americans needed to get back to work.
Franklin D. Roosevelt came to office at a terrible time in America where 1 out of 4 people who wanted jobs and needed jobs could not find jobs. A lot of parents had children who were going hungry, and Franklin D. Roosevelt decided that the only way to get the economy going again was for the government to spend a lot of money and even go into deficit, up to a point where people could get their jobs back again.
Roosevelt launched the New Deal, which created programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and massive public works projects designed to provide jobs for Americans. It was kind of like a massive chore list for the American public in exchange for an allowance. To sell his ideas to the public, FDR embraced the new technology of the day and aired radio broadcasts that he called fireside chats. Today, he'd probably do a podcast.
Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat was very simply the forerunner of every presidential address that we see today. But it was a radical break, taking advantage of the latest technology. Radio was coming into its own. Franklin Roosevelt became the first president to really effectively use radio. His signature opening was, "My friends," and they believed him.
And FDR used the radio to help people understand his policy decisions.
He closed down the banks for a couple of days and then helped explain to people how the banks worked, how they shouldn't pull all their money out of it, and he inspired confidence.
Though the New Deal provided a financial safety net for many Americans, some felt that Roosevelt was exercising too much power as president and spending too much of America's money. Another strain on America's finances was the war overseas, which landed on America's shores at Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
FDR had to shift focus away from the economic hard times to begin the task of being a war president.
Franklin Roosevelt led America to prepare for war. The draft was reinstated. The armed forces were building even before Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And then afterwards, Roosevelt, working with his ally in Britain, Winston Churchill, helped bring out the success and the strength of America. It was the end of the Depression. It was an incredible expansion of America's industrial capacity.
Unfortunately, while fighting for freedom abroad, Roosevelt severely restricted the freedoms of Japanese Americans at home.
Franklin Roosevelt is lionized for winning World War II, but he's also criticized for putting 110,000 Japanese Americans in what were in effect concentration camps.
Roosevelt has also been criticized for not doing more to stop the systematic murder of the Jews during the Holocaust.
He said the only way to help the Jews was to defeat Germany on the battlefield. This policy was called rescue through victory. Jewish organizations worried, however, that if rescue was postponed until the day of Allied victory, there might not be any Jews left alive to save.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our longest-serving president, lived to see the end of the Depression, but missed the official end of World War II by just a few months. The Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, but FDR had died in office 4 months earlier. Fortunately, though, he had already checked off most of the items on his presidential chore list.